I really hope that my tone does not come across as condescending.
Jordan annexed the West Bank. 1950. They literally annexed it. They gave citizenship. Yes, literally. They literally did. It was, yes.
You want to debate semantics about all of this and refusing, again, insisting on getting into a level of weeds here.
It's very annoying that people accuse me of not knowing anything about this topic, but then I understand when you're debating things like this, you don't know anything about the topic. And that's why you get upset when you talk about like getting in the weeds.
So they work in collaboration to advance a shared interests of Egypt, of the United States, and
that's
of Israel.
The only reason why Egypt doesn't want Palestinians that come from the Gaza Strip into the Sinai Peninsula. There's no history of terrorist attacks or illegal shipment of weapons or anything like that.
Egypt does not like the Muslim Brotherhood, and Hamas is announced with the Muslim Brotherhood.
Okay. Why can't we say, okay, sure, Israel put the blockade up because people like Iran and Turkey were shipping in weapons to the Gaza Strip in submersibles that were used throughout all of Israel during the Second Intifada of 2000-2004, and then once Hamas took over and then essentially ejected Fatah from the region, Israel felt like Hamas was going to continue to engage in attacks against Israel, so they wanted to blockade to prevent weapons from going in. Now, you can say that and still say you feel like Hamas can fight, but why not be honest about why the blockade exists?
No, I feel like we're playing a game, and I really am doing my best to have this exchange.
Hold on, I don't appreciate it playing a game because you're not aware of the underlying facts.
Israel wants to control what's being let in and let out.
Of course, because these people have been sending rockets at him for the past 20 years. Yeah, they do. They literally are doing it. Yes. I know that you keep saying that. This is hilarious. They don't want to get lost in the weeds. They don't want to deal with the history. You just don't know the facts. And people like you, by the way, are contributing to the enduring bad situations on the ground. Because as long as you continue to think there's only one side here that's doing any wrong, there's never going to be any enduring resolution, any lasting peace.
How are you?
Pretty good. How you doing?
I'm doing all right. Good to be on with you. I've never done one of these long YouTube loose shows before, so that's fun.
Yeah. Well, welcome. We're live, so don't give any personal revealing information or say anything crazy.
Sounds good.
Do you want to introduce yourself so people know who you are?
Sure. I'm Omar Baddar. I'm a Palestinian American. I've been active on this issue for pretty much my entire adult life. Studied it in school, and I've done a ton of advocacy on it, and it's an issue that I think American foreign policy is a disaster on and has been for a very, very long time, and one in which I think it's essentially a moral blight on America's conscience to pretend that we have come such a long way on a wide range of issues in terms of opposition to racism and apartheid, and looking at all the stuff that we've done in our history as long past, and then supporting what I view as a policy that is completely inexcusable in terms of what Israel has been doing to Palestinians for decades now, and the U.S. insisting on unlimited military, diplomatic, and financial support of it.
All right. Well, where do you want to start? I saw you tweeted at me because the other guy tweeted at me. Everybody's tweeting at me. So, yeah. Do you want to... are you familiar with anything I've said on the topic? So you'd have like a particular criticism, or what do you?
I mean, look, what I saw is your debate with Ben Shapiro, and it's obviously not much of a debate because I think you're a little bit out of your depth on this particular issue, and that's not like a criticism of you. I mean, nobody can be an expert on every topic in the world, so. Nonetheless, you nodded along to a ton of nonsense that he said, so I think you gave him way too many passes. And then separately, there's a clip of you circulating online saying that you support genociding Palestinians. I imagine that's a joke. I don't think it's a funny one given everything that is happening now. But yeah, that's basically my exposure of your stuff on this particular topic. And happy to start it however you want. I don't know what's the best angle on this.
Do you want to do the, well, you felt like there were parts that I let Ben Shapiro slide on, and then I imagine I probably said things in in agreement that you would disagree with. Yeah, do you want to start on any of those? What do you think?
Sure, let's do that. So, I mean, honestly, a couple of things. Big picture, Israel has been practicing apartheid against Palestinians for a very, very long time. Their occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem is illegal under international law. The United Nations has called on Israel to withdraw from these territories repeatedly. Eventually, Palestinians came along to acknowledge the fact that they are the weaker party and cannot reclaim their entire historic homeland, settled for a land division in which Israel gets to keep 80% of the territory, which is Israel as recognized by the UN, and Israel is obligated to withdraw from those occupied territories, the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. And that was the idea behind the so-called peace process. And what Israel did throughout that entire peace process is build more and more settlements throughout the occupied territories, They entrenched that occupation. They made it impossible for Palestinians to have any path towards genuine independence. And every human rights organization in the world at this point, all the big ones, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, and even Israel's largest human rights organization, B'Tselem, all acknowledge that Israel is practicing apartheid in the occupied Palestinian territories, at least, and some of them go to say apartheid in all of Israel, frankly, in which one set of people gets rights on account of being Jewish Israelis, and then different categories of Palestinians getting fewer and fewer rights, and an act of ethnic cleansing in slow motion that we've been watching for decades. And Palestinians have pursued every method possible to achieve freedom, and all of them have led to a dead end because Israel has no interest in allowing Palestinians to live as a free people. That is the fundamental reality. And everything that you can accuse Palestinians of having done wrong towards Israel or Israelis, Israel has done to Palestinians at 100 times greater scale. That's a fundamental injustice in which, when you look back at, say, South Africa, we can understand that the ANC sometimes set off bombs and killed white people in South Africa, and you can say that's wrong. Of course it is. But the fundamental reality is that unless you solve the underlying injustice, you're not going to get anywhere better. And this seems to be a part of the conversation that is entirely missed or ignored or overlooked here, is that until you solve the problem of Israeli occupation and apartheid, this kind of going back and forth about individual acts of violence and kind of doing this both sides nonsense where we pretend like all sides are equally guilty of everything or whatnot is really missing a fundamental reality, which is Palestinians are an oppressed and occupied people. Israel is an oppressor and an occupier force supported by the United States, and that gives Israel a sense of impunity that allows it to carry on doing whatever the hell it wants at the expense of people and their fundamental ability to live in freedom and human rights.
Okay. I'll give like an overtake on what you said, and then we can kind of like dive into any individual thing if you want.
Sure.
I'm wholly uninterested in the apartheid claims. They might be true, they might not be true. The issue that I have with talking and fixating so much on the apartheid stuff is I feel like the apartheid is a consequence of the occupation. That Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip are probably never going to have the same rights living under military tribunals and living as not an actual country, but under an occupying power like Israel. And I don't even know if I would expect them to. I think the reason why I've read the UN's, or I've read an article that the UN published on one of their sites. I don't know if they have a full report on how they call it apartheid, but essentially they call it apartheid from what I gathered because of the enduring conditions of the occupation. So for instance, with a 5-year occupation, we probably wouldn't use the term apartheid, but since it's been going on almost indefinitely and it feels like there's no end to it, well, now if this is the permanent country that you're going to be born into and die in, and you're living as a second-class citizen, it's kind of apartheid. So I agree that there is like apartheid, or at least some form of apartheid. I kind of agree with that. I just don't think that's ever going to be fixed insofar as like it's an occupied area. Like you would never expect an occupying power to give the same rights to occupiers. So I think that the fixation has to be on solving the occupation, whether that means giving them a country or whatever that means. That's the solution to the apartheid part. Apartheid is never getting fixed as long as it's an occupation. For the second thing, for the peace process, we can dive into these in particular. Israel just built more and more settlements. I think after the Oslo Accords, Israel actually slowed down all the settlements in the West Bank almost entirely. Even under Netanyahu, you can look at the numbers of settlements built. They were expanding within settlements where more and more houses were being built, but no new settlements were being constructed. And the construction of homes within the settlements that did exist had actually slowed down dramatically from 93 to 2000. When you said it made it impossible for Palestinians to pursue peace, I think Palestinians have made it impossible for Palestinians to pursue peace, but we could talk about that. The act of ethnic cleansing in slow motion, if it's ethnic cleansing or genocide, it's probably one of the least effective ethnic cleansings or genocides I've ever seen in my entire life. I think that's kind of a silly claim. When we say Palestinians have pursued peace as much as they can, I completely and utterly disagree. I think that Israel has made a few really good faith efforts towards trying to pursue peace, but I think that Palestinians have always thought that fighting is more in their interest than not. And I think that's why Arafat walked away from things like the Camp David summit in 2000, or why things like the Clinton parameters and everything were shot down. I don't know if the Palestinians have ever seriously considered a peace process that involves a two-state solution. I feel like their only goal is a one-state solution, and I think most of the population polling data seems to support that a one-state solution through violence with unequal rights for citizens is the preference. And then I would wholly reject any comparisons to the ANC. The ANC didn't target civilians. The ANC didn't believe in like martyrdom or shaheed. The ANC, didn't have suicide bombers running into buses. The ANC wasn't committing intifadas, especially the second intifada from 2000 to 2004. I just don't think that the ANC has any resemblance whatsoever to the Palestinian people or the current Palestinian struggle. I know people like to draw comparisons to South Africa because they want to lean into that apartheid comparison, but I think it's pretty wacky when you look at the stated goals and how both sides conduct themselves to compare the two. Yeah, we can go into whatever part here you want. We can dive as deep as you want into it. Yeah.
Happy to talk about them one at a time.
Sure.
And again, I really hope that my tone does not come across as condescending.
No, you're good.
Just your information about this is simply inaccurate. It's factually incorrect, and I'm happy to just share the correct information with you.
Yeah, go for it.
On terms of the settler population in the West Bank settlement expansion did not slow down. The settler population between 1993 and 2000 actually doubled. So when the peace process meant that Israel was going to withdraw from these occupied territories, and I just want to be clear, every single one of these settlements is illegal under international law. It's just building colonies. If Russia were to come and invade the United States and start building exclusivist Russian cities, where they push Americans out of cities in California and bring Russians to live in those cities, the correct response is you have to dismantle that. That is not allowed to exist. So existing Israeli settlements were illegal to begin with throughout the West Bank. And Israel responded not by dismantling settlements, but by expanding settlements. And that population expanded very, very rapidly throughout the so-called peace process. So Israel was basically playing a game. They were withdrawing from certain major cities in the Palestinian territories. They let the Palestinians control Ramallah. They let the Palestinians control Jericho. But effectively, in terms of control of the West Bank entirely, Israeli control of the West Bank was actually expanding. So that's the reason why the so-called peace process failed. Now, if you look at it from the perspective of somebody like Bill Clinton or mainstream American officials, they'll put the blame on Palestinians for the failure of the peace process on the grounds that they should have just been grateful for whatever Israelis were willing to give them. But the reality is the most generous offer that Israel made Palestinians towards statehood came in 2000. It's known as the Camp David II Accords. And Israel's foreign minister at the time, his name is Shlomo Ben Ami, and you can look up his debate with Norman Finkelstein on Democracy Now! He said, Israel's foreign minister said, if I were Palestinian, I would not have accepted that deal. So that gives you a sense of how little meaningful control Israel was willing to cede towards Palestinians, that Israel was going to be effectively in control of all their borders and all of their land, that you go from one Palestinian city to another, you have to go through an Israeli checkpoint or a method of control. That's not freedom and that's not statehood. That is effectively a pretense of a state that is living under effective Israeli control.
Sure. Now, so the my understanding is, so the population in the settlements might have continued to grow from 93 to 2000, but there were no new new settlements started, and then construction within the settlements slowed significantly, such that prior to 93, I think it was on average 13,000 to 14,000 new housing units were constructed every single year. And then from 94 or 93 to, I think it was to 97, that number was less than 5,000. It was only new housing units that were being constructed, and there were no new settlements created.
So the settler population expanded from over 100,000.
I understand. So when we say settler population, that's different than new settlements, right?
Yes. And expanding settlements, I mean, just for clarity's sake, I feel like we can get into the weeds on this. I
want to get into the weeds. That's where I want to go. Yeah.
Yeah.
We can go very into the weeds. I think it's very important to get into the weeds on this because there's a lot of stuff in the weeds
totally
that people
fine.
seem to miss. Yeah. So I think I agree with you that the settlement population basically doubled from 93 to 2000, but there were no new settlements made, and there was only expansion within settlements, and even that expansion within settlements had slowed quite a bit. I think it was cut by about 66%.
The word within the settlements, I think, is a little bit misleading because these settlements expand outwards. Construction, the act of pushing Palestinians out of their land in order to expand settlements, is an ongoing process. So Palestinians were losing land in the West Bank while Israel was expanding settlements at a time when the entire idea was that Israel was going to withdraw from the occupied territories from the West Bank to allow a Palestinian state to exist. So Israel was doing the exact opposite of what it was obligated to do.
Well, yeah. So I agree that there's expansion, but one of the big things was after the Oslo Accords was hopefully no new settlements. Now, that wasn't even technically a formal agreement, and there was no formal agreement in place from 93 onwards yet to completely withdraw from the West Bank because they hadn't set that deal out, right? The Oslo Accords was really only establishing the Palestinian Authority government and starting to hand over basically security arrangements to the Palestinians in the West Bank and hopefully the Gaza Strip. And then hopefully that would lead to, I think the goal was originally 5 years. It got pushed to 7, and then that fell apart, and then the Second Intifada happened. But the goal was that hopefully after 5 years of this transitional government, there would be a new enduring peace process that would be negotiated. But for the Oslo Accords, very specifically, there were no actual agreements made about what it would look like in 5 years because they just weren't ready to negotiate that.
Yeah, I think we're missing the forest for the trees here. The idea is Israel's presence in the West Bank is illegal. They have to leave.
Whether something is legal or illegal is not really at issue here. Like everything here, the legality of all of this is illegal under whose jurisdiction?
International law is very clear.
International law is not clear. International law is incredibly ambiguous. Israel and plenty of the surrounding states aren't signatories to the ICC. In order for the ICJ to make a ruling on something, you've got to submit yourself to the authority of the ICJ and say they even can. So I mean, like to say that like international law is clear here, like people have opinions, sure, but like all of this is incredibly murky. There are some readings of international law that would say technically the only people that own any land here is an emerging state from a conflict in which Israel was the only emerging state post 48. So there's an argument to be made that like Israel owns all the land technically. So I mean, like to say international law is clear here is
anybody can say whatever they want. That is true. However, the consensus is the International Court of Justice, the UN Security Council, the UN General Assembly, and every major human rights organization in the world. If you want to take all of those and say their opinion matters as much as bump whatever somebody sitting in their basement and spouting about what legality means, you can do that. But I think we are pretty damn clear about the fact that international law, UN Resolution 242 that came immediately after Israel took over the West Bank, said the acquisition of territory by war is illegal under international law. That's what the resolution said, and said based on that, Israel is obligated to withdraw from the occupied territories. Israel did not want to withdraw from the occupied territories. There was a thing there about how first you need reciprocation of Palestinians recognizing Israel. That came at the beginning of the so-called peace process. So the Palestinians fulfilled the first half of that, if you want to insist on that being a condition. And Israel responded by expanding its occupation. And so the International Court of Justice in 2004 weighed in on Israel building a wall throughout the West Bank. And they said, frankly, their explanation for building that wall, they're building it within occupied territories. They're building it to protect illegal settlements that are built on top of Palestinian land. All of that is illegal. And so that wall is also illegal. So this is really straightforward. And I think that we do the audience a disservice by pretending that there's a lot of kind of murky, this talk of disputed territories in the Palestinian territories, I think, is extremely unhelpful because the dispute is between Israel on the one hand and the rest of the world on the other. There's been a short exception to that, which is when Trump came into office, he joined Israel into declaring that the occupation and the settlements are not illegal. But again, I would not want to be on the side of Trump and Netanyahu. I would rather be on the side of the entire international human rights consensus and international law consensus on this, which is that Israel's occupation and settlements and wall in the West Bank are absolutely and categorically illegal. I would like to touch on a couple of other
again, like the legality question here. First of all, when we're citing like human rights organizations or UN General Assembly, like all the UN General Assembly resolutions are non-binding. When you look at like a resolution like 242, it doesn't even really make sense. And I like the advisory opinions or opinions given by like UN General Assembly bodies just doesn't really mean much. And again, like the legality, like the opinions of the ICJ that's being asked to give an opinion on something where neither territory is actually submitting themselves to the jurisdiction or rulings of the ICJ. Turns out, insofar as international law goes, it's kind of pointless. I mean, they're nice arguments and we can use them, I guess, if we feel like they're bolstering something, but they don't really address any of the issues on the ground and they don't really get us any closer to an actual peace process. I think even you would agree that screaming at Israel over and over again, hey, there are some people that think that what you're doing is illegal, doesn't really get us anywhere. It's not.
No. I think when one country steals land from another people against international law and is ethnically cleansing them in slow motion, pushing them out of their homes, driving them out of their homes to the condemnation of every human rights organization in the world, I think screaming at them about that is the right thing to do. And it comes down to the governments that are supplying and enabling that. The United States government should not be sending weapons to a country that is engaging in human rights violations and land theft on this scale. That's the fundamental reality. Look,
when we say okay, so we can go into this as deep as you want to. I'd love to. When we say steals land from another people, when we say Israel steals land from another people, what does that mean?
It means Palestinians have Israeli soldiers. I can send you videos if you have not seen them.
Okay.
Who knock on their doors in a place like occupied East Jerusalem, which again, under international law, which you don't seem to care so much about. I mean, by the way, if you want to go down that line of dismissing international law, then by all means, Russia invading Ukraine is just fine. And if China wants to take over part of the United States, that's also okay. Who's to say it's all disputed? I don't think that's a useful frame of reference.
Well, I don't think China invading countries or Russia invading countries is a lot different, because you have internationally recognized sovereign states with borders that even those countries had recognized that are being invaded. That's a lot different than whatever the situation is right now in Israel and Palestine. When we say Israel's stealing land from people, who did Israel steal land from? When you pointed back to Resolution 242, what is that referring to? Who did they steal land from?
Resolution 242 says that Israel taking over the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem violates international law because those are not part of Israel. At the time, the West Bank was under Jordanian control and Gaza was under Egyptian control.
Wait. They were part of those countries, right?
No,
they didn't belong to Palestine. Of course, Jordan literally why do you think Jordan today is 2/3 Palestinians? They literally gave citizenship and made citizens every single person living in the West Bank.
No. You're confused. Jordan was not part of Jordan officially. Jordan right now, by the way. Well, Jordan is not, the West Bank is not part of Jordan. So when Israel was founded in 1948, they took over 78% of historic Palestine. The parts they did not take over were the West Bank and Gaza, and that's when those areas fell under Jordanian control and Egyptian control.
Correct. Jordan annexed the West Bank. 1950. They literally annexed it. They gave citizenship to, yes, literally. They literally did. It was, yes. That's why it was called... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, the impression that I'm under right now is that you want to debate semantics about all of this and refusing, again, insisting on getting into a level of weeds here that is designed specifically to miss the overarching picture.
Okay.
The overarching picture, again, for simplicity's sake, the entire world agrees that the West Bank is not part of Israel and Israel is obligated to withdraw from it. Israel entered a peace process in 1993 that is premised on withdrawing from the occupied territories.
No, they're not.
They did the opposite.
The Oslo Accords were not premised on that. They were the Oslo Accords. No, they weren't.
They were premised on the idea of creating a Palestinian state within 5 years in the occupied territory.
There were no concrete resolutions set on the Oslo Accords. That's why in 5 years they needed to revisit to do an actual peace process. The Oslo Accords did not make any actual commitments. Also, it's very annoying that people accuse me of not knowing anything about this topic, but then I understand when you're debating things like this, you don't know anything about the topic, and that's why you get upset when you talk about like getting in the weeds. Even that quote that you gave earlier from the Israeli foreign minister about how like I wouldn't have accepted the deal if I was a Palestinian. That's not what he said. That's not what that quote says. And if you actually go to the book and you actually read the passage where he talks about it, what he said was that conditions were not right at the time for Palestinians to feel like they could accept that deal. But he was talking about the conditions that existed throughout the country, not that it was a bad deal. Universally, every other person in the Arab world, the Egyptian leadership, Saudi foreign ambassador said that these deals were amazing, that what was coming after Camp David, what was being negotiated at the Tabla Summit, these were unbelievable deals, that Arafat went into these things expecting 91% of the land, and by the end, with land swaps, he was getting 95 to 97% of the original land that the Palestinians had. The idea that these were horrible deals that were being put before them is not true. And the idea that the Oslo Accords were some permanently negotiated peace status is also not true. That's why there was going to be another meeting in 5 years, ideally, to figure out what the permanent arrangements would be. I don't agree that anything's getting lost in the weeds. I think it's really important to know the specifics.
No, I'm catching on to your style about this. I think you're less interested in the actual topic and more interested in winning an argument based on kind of like silly and manufactured points. It's quite transparently what is happening here.
Wait, what is, don't you think it's important to understand like what Jordan's goal was when they invaded the West Bank, or what Egypt was doing when they invaded the Gaza Strip, rather than just screaming apartheid over and over again?
I think it's important to engage in good faith and to know what you're talking about and to not say things that you don't understand. I've watched that debate with Israel's foreign minister on more than one occasion. What he was saying is that the deal that was offered to Palestinians at the end of Camp David was a bad deal, and if he were Palestinian, he would not have accepted it. And
that's literally not what he said. If you watch the debate, and I watched that debate, it was literally hosted on Democracy Now!, and he's quoting his own book. And if you go back and read the book instead of just watching a YouTube video, you'll see the context of what was given. And what was given was that
we'll make that available. I'm glad you're saying that. I think we're going to be able to clip this up. I'm going to clip up that part of the debate. We'll put it up there with the quotes of the book, which I have sitting on my shelf. I'm happy to do all of this.
Okay. I hope they're your quotes and not quotes from a Finkelstein book about what the interview was.
No, don't worry. It'll be a clip of Shlomo Ben Ami speaking in his own words. I'm happy to put that together. Now, Would you like to move on to the current situation, or would you like to still debate the peace process specifically? I'm happy to do either way.
Well, the problem is in the current situation, people make so many bad allusions to history that is not true that it makes it hard to understand like where
history is rather straightforward. Palestinians are being denied freedom because Palestinians is not allowing them to be free. That is all there is to say about it. It literally is documented bit by bit. Palestinians are living under Israeli control. By the way, this apartheid claim that you seem to be so dismissive of, from the river to the sea, the only government that is in charge in any meaningful sense is the Israeli government. There is limited self-governance in the West Bank under the Palestinian Authority. There is limited self-governance in Gaza under Hamas, but Israel controls the borders of everyone. Nobody can visit Gaza or the West Bank without going through an Israeli border. Gaza does not have an airport. This is before October 7th.
Wait, you can't get into Gaza without going through an Israeli border?
Without Israeli permission, or on the Egyptian side,
there you go.
Effectively the Egyptian government is working in collaboration with the Israeli government. However, this idea that Gaza's occupation ended when Israel withdrew settlers in 2005 is a complete and total lie, and the simple evidence of it is there was an airport in Gaza that Israel bombed, and Gaza was never allowed to rebuild an airport. There is a seaport, in theory, that you could have in Gaza, but Israel does not allow anyone to visit Gaza without going through Israeli checks. And in some cases...
When we're looking at these restrictions here, why does Egypt restrict access to the Gaza Strip if it's so horrible what Israel's doing? Why does Jordan restrict access to the West Bank if it's so horrible what Israel is doing?
Yeah, and in the case of the West Bank, it's an Israeli border control that you're going through, not a Jordanian one. So Israel is in control of the West Bank. In the case of Gaza and Egypt, the Egyptian government effectively is on the U.S.-Israeli team. That is really effectively all there is to say about that. So they work in collaboration to advance a shared interests of Egypt, of the United States, and
That's
of Israel.
The only reason why Egypt doesn't want Palestinians that come from the Gaza Strip into the Sinai Peninsula. There's no history of terrorist attacks or illegal shipment of weapons or anything like that.
Egypt does not like the Muslim Brotherhood, and Hamas is an outfit of the Muslim Brotherhood.
Go.
But still, again, well, thank you for the 1,000 deviations. I get what you're attempting to do.
They're not thousands of deviations. They're important to understand the history because, again, you misrepresent this as just Israel, the big bad bully oppressing the Palestinians.
No, here's what you don't understand. I don't care if Egypt wants to close its border with Gaza. They're welcome to do that. I don't care if Israel wants to close this border with Gaza. By all means, do that. But when Israel imposes a blockade on Gaza and doesn't allow them to have an airport and doesn't allow ships to come into Gaza, that is not ending the occupation. That is Israel very much being in charge.
Sure.
And
why does
Gaza.
The blockade exist?
And, well, let me ask you this question in relation to that. Why does that blockade exist? Did you know that at the beginning of the blockade, potato chips were not allowed in? Sodas were not allowed in? Cookies were not allowed in? Can you explain to me what threat cookies pose to Israel from your perspective?
Well, if they're the Keebler Elf ones, it's like 200 calories a cookie, so maybe they just didn't want people getting fat. Why does the blockade exist for the Gaza Strip? Why is there a blockade at all?
So because the blockade included food items, and I will tell you what the Israeli officials said at the time when they imposed the blockade.
Okay.
They said they want to put the people of Gaza on a diet and restrict their caloric intake as a means of making life uncomfortable for the civilian population so that they would put pressure on the Hamas government.
Okay.
That is an act of collective punishment that violates international law, which I know you don't care much about international law. Clearly, you think it's a dispute that anybody can just pull out of their ass and think whatever they want about. But punishing civilian populations in order to produce a political change is practically the definition of terrorism. So you have a population that is experiencing humanitarian hardship by design by a country that dominates their lives.
Gotcha. Wait, so why does the blockade exist?
Because Hamas does not want to play ball with Israel. That's why. Israel.
What does that mean? Hamas doesn't want to play ball with Israel. That's like the fourth time I've asked you. I'm just curious. Why would Israel put up a blockade? Was it just to starve those poor people? Why don't they have a blockade in the West Bank?
Because Hamas does not have a peace agreement with Israel. Hamas
That's it? That's the only reason, just because they don't have a peace agreement?
Well, Israel had 3 conditions for Hamas in order for them to establish normal relations and for there not to be a blockade. They wanted them to be a replica of the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. They said you have to recognize Israel, you have to renounce violence, and you have to abide by all previous agreements that Israel had made with the Palestinian Authority. Now, what's ironic about that is that Israel does not recognize Palestine. Israel does not renounce violence. It engages in military attacks on Palestinians all the time. And Israel clearly does not abide by the previous agreements because they violated them over and over and over again by undermining the prospect of an emerging Palestinian state. So Israel wanted to hold Hamas to a standard that Israel itself was not being held to. And that brings us back to a fundamental relationship of dominance between Israel and the Palestinians. Israel believes and feels as if it can order Palestinians to do whatever Israel wants, and they have to obey, and the opposite relationship is not required, that Israel can take whatever lands it wants, can control whatever borders it wants, and Palestinians have to obey. If, let me ask you this and flip it around, if Hamas had put a blockade on all of Israel and said we're going to cut off certain foods from the Israeli population to make them uncomfortable and lower their caloric intake until the Israeli government agrees to A, B, and C, what would your reaction to that be?
Well, first, I would really want to know, why does Israel blockade the Gaza Strip? I think it's the fifth time I asked this question.
I've answered you already. It's because Hamas took over the Gaza Strip, and Israel does not like Hamas. They see them as a hostile entity, and they said you have to meet certain requirements in order for us to end the blockade. And to reiterate once more, the blockade cannot be justified on security grounds, because part of what was not being allowed in were things that were explicitly meant to harm the civilian population within Gaza.
Okay.
It is not a military blockade that is done for security purposes if you're restricting people from being able to eat cookies and chips and sodas in Gaza.
So one of the things that's frustrating about the Israel-Palestine debate is, like Ben Shapiro, on the other end, you just have people that are blindly partisan. We can't acknowledge at all why Israel would blockade the Gaza Strip. You're going to tell me it was to install these harsh humanitarian conditions that are somehow putting the whole population on a diet and starving them when their population is like tripled? Like, it doesn't even make sense. Why can't we at least acknowledge, like, okay, sure. Why can't we say, okay, sure, Israel put the blockade up because people like Iran and Turkey were shipping in weapons to the Gaza Strip in submersibles that were used throughout all of Israel during the Second Intifada of 2000-2004. And then once Hamas took over and then essentially ejected Fatah from the region, Israel felt like Hamas was going to continue to engage in attacks against Israel. So they wanted to blockade to prevent weapons from going in. Now, you can say that and still say you feel like Hamas can fight, but why not be honest about why the blockade exists? And even when you say things like they were blocking things like sugar related items like cookies and everything, isn't that literally one of the big fields that they used for their early Qassam rockets? Was literally like fertilizer and sugar that they would mix to shoot rockets continuously over into Israel?
Again, do I call you Stephen or Destiny? I'm not sure.
Stephen is fine.
Stephen is fine. Stephen, I feel like we're playing a game, and I really am doing my best to have this.
Hold on, I don't appreciate it playing a game because you're not aware of the underlying facts. If there's something that I said was incorrect or irrelevant, wait, can you point to me exactly what I said was incorrect or irrelevant to what my argument I just made? No, wait, don't. You just tell me what for what I just said. What part of that was either incorrect or irrelevant?
Here, let me point it out to you. Please listen very, very carefully. I'm going to be as clear as I can be.
I feel like you're just going to do another talking point. You're not actually going to address anything I just said, but okay.
When I tell you, I'm going to address it extremely directly. Okay. Let me see how directly I can. I'm going to do my best to state this in a way that everybody can be very clear about what I'm saying.
Okay.
When I tell you that Israel prevented food items from going into Gaza, including potato chips, and that Israeli officials said they want to put people in Gaza on a diet and lower their caloric intake, and you respond by saying sugar can be used for Qassam rockets, you're playing a game. You're not engaging with this seriously. I am pointing out to you that Israeli officials restricted food going into Gaza, and they explicitly said it is for the purpose of making civilians uncomfortable. Can you engage honestly in this point that I just made right now?
I am aware that there are quotes from Israeli leadership that are definitely unhinged when it comes to people in the Gaza Strip sometimes, or Palestinians in general. But when I try to look at like what is the ultimate outcome, what's actually happening, are the people in Gaza being starved? When that population has exploded, one of the highest birth rates in the past 2 decades, I don't understand how they could sustain it if they didn't have food.
If you want to judge it exclusively by that people are still able to have children when they're being treated like utter garbage, that means they're not being treated so bad.
We weren't talking about being treated like utter garbage. Your implication was that they're being starved.
Yeah, the Israeli officials said, by the way, and you know why that blockade ended up, why they started letting food into Gaza after that? Because a series of humanitarian ships known as the Turkish flotilla at the time tried to break through that siege to deliver food and medicine to Gaza in protest of Israel's unlawful siege.
First of all, those ships weren't trying to deliver food and aid. Those ships were just there as protest. No, they weren't. 3 of the 5 ships were empty. I'm very familiar with the flotilla incident. If you're not, I would not go here because this was clearly a political stunt that was done. There's video footage of the people on the boats fighting the IDF. There were firearms and everything collected from the boat. They were literally trying.
This is not a good faith conversation. It really is not.
How is it not? Because you're not familiar with any of the details of what you're talking about? Because you only have talking points?
Who cares about an empty ship?
Because if your goal is to bring humanitarian supplies, why is over half your fleet empty? Because their goal wasn't to bring humanitarian supplies. It was to create propaganda talking points of people like you. They had no desire to actually bring humanitarian supplies there. The Coast Guard, Israel literally said, if you want to bring them in, park here and we can wheel it in after we inspect the cargo.
Israel wants to control what's being let in and let out.
Of course, because these people have been sending rockets at them for the past 20 years. Yeah, they do. They literally are doing it. Yes.
No, they do not get to do that. They do not get to do that. They don't own the Gaza Strip any more than Hamas gets to control Israel's borders, because Israel receives weapons from the United States and uses them to impose an illegal occupation on Palestinians and destroy their homes and take over their land. Would you accept a Hamas blockade that any ship that is going to Tel Aviv has to stop and Hamas has to inspect it to make sure American weapons are not on it?
No, of course not.
You would not. And that's that you're putting your finger exactly on what the problem is. You're saying Israel gets to act as if it owns the Palestinians.
Because they do. They control all that space. Yes.
No, they don't get to control that space.
They literally do. They literally have been. Yes.
Yes. That's called an illegal occupation. That is what that is. They're controlling other people against their will in violation of international law. That's the whole point. Palestinians are not free. That is the fundamental reality.
What do you think is if Palestinians don't want a two-state solution, what is Israel supposed to do?
Yeah, Palestinians bent over backwards to try to allow for a Palestinian state to emerge and for a two-state solution to exist. Again,
what happened in 2000 when Arafat literally walked away from Camp David, when nothing further was solidified in the Taba summit?
Walked away after 7 years of a fake peace process in which Israel claimed that they were going to withdraw from the occupied territories, and what they did instead is expand more and more settlements and entrench their occupation of the West Bank.
No new settlements were created. They didn't claim they were going to fully withdraw because nothing was on the table. That's just not what the Oslo Accords were about. Arafat signed these and he was happy about them, and he went to the negotiating table in 2000. Nobody says that he walked away because
you're repeating talking points that you simply don't know and don't understand. That's the reality. Palestinians wanted.
Yeah. So he didn't walk away. Why did he even start the negotiations in 2000 if he just didn't want to do them?
I'll tell you what the negotiations were about. He started the negotiations because he thought that Israel was going to allow for a Palestinian state to exist. And 7 years later, they realized that Israel was playing a game, that they were not serious about ending the occupation, that they never froze settlement building. That's one of the things you nodded along when Ben Shapiro said it.
Because Israel they didn't build new settlements.
Israel did not once freeze settlement building. Every American president had pleaded with them to stop building settlements, and Israel never did. They announced settlement freezes in which East Jerusalem was excluded, even though East Jerusalem is occupied Palestinian territory, in which they can slow it down here and slow it down there. But there was never, ever a serious commitment to end the land theft of Palestinians, to end the expansion of that land theft.
And I think the reason why is because there was never a serious commitment by Palestinians to a two-state solution.
That's nonsense. The Palestinians made the offer quite open. When you look at, they said, when you talk about Arafat walking away, the Palestinian position is end the occupation, go back to the 67 borders, you get to keep 80% of the land, we get 20%. And Israel said,
I don't know what the 80-20% is. You can't. There is no
Israel, as recognized by international law right now, is about 78% of historic Palestine.
We're not. No one is talking about historic Palestine. Right? We're way past that. Now we're at the Palestinians and Arabs already said no to that when in 47 with the initial UN partition. So we already ignored that. So that's gone. That's off the table.
Yeah.
Now this
is insufferable. No, it's not gone. I don't know what you're talking about.
You don't get to say you don't get to have an agreement on the table and then say no. Actually, we're going to try to kill all of you. And then when you fail, go okay. Well, let's go back to that agreement. 47 and 48 is off the table.
Let's go over this again. And please, seriously, I'm asking you, I get that you have a dynamic with your followers or whatever, and you're winning arguments and doing great. Please try to listen genuinely and sincerely for a moment. Palestinians in 1947 were being asked to give up more than half of their country to allow for the creation of a Jewish state. And they said no to that.
What country?
What do you mean, what country? It doesn't have to be a sovereign country.
There was no country there. There were a collection of tribes and people that lived there, subsistence farmers. There was no country of Palestine.
They lived there. That's all that matters. This is like saying that white settlers taking over the United States was fine.
You keep bringing up the United States. The United States is a sovereign state with recognized borders. You just said that there was no sovereign state of Palestine in 47.
Native Americans did not have a sovereign state that was recognized by the UN. When European settlers were pushing Native Americans out of their lands here, we recognized that as wrong, even though there was not a sovereign state. When Israel was created, a series of massacres were committed against Palestinian towns and villages. 700,000 people were driven from their homes.
First of all, 700. So it was like
towns and
it was like
villages were
20,000 people. I think 10 to 20,000 people were driven from their homes. The rest left because they were worried about violence. But not 700,000 people weren't driven from their homes.
Yeah, you can. No. If that's a distinction that is meaningful to you, you're free. You're free to
that
feel
distinction
that.
is absolutely. Oh, okay. Well, I'm sorry. Would you agree then? Would you agree that millions of Jews were driven from their homes across the entirety of all the Arab states after 48, after 67, after 73?
Hundreds of thousands. Yes, and I think that there is a plausible case to make for that being the correct language for it. And frankly, there is admissions of Zionists playing a part in that to try to make Jews feel less safe in other parts of the Middle East in order to drive them to Israel. Again, not history I'm expecting you to be familiar with, and that's okay.
I'm super familiar.
But for the sake of not missing the core argument that you brought up that I want to mention.
Okay.
When Israel was created, more than 500 Palestinian towns and villages were erased. And the reason why they were erased is because they did not want Palestinians to be able to come back. If Palestinians, let's take your argument. Let's say Palestinians packed up and left in 1948 on their own. They went to vacation. They packed up and went to Disneyland. Why are they not allowed to return? What exactly gives Israel the right to say that these refugees don't get to come back home? They don't have that right. So the point is...
Why don't they get to return? It's because they left and then they waged war against Israel to try to destroy them. Why would you want them back after?
Who's the they? The civilian population?
The civilian population, the surrounding Arab states, yes.
Yeah. So Israel imposed itself on Palestinians, engaged in a campaign of ethnic cleansing, drove them out of their homes and took over their land and created a Jewish state.
So and then, Israel in 47, okay, the Brits gave a potential split for who would own what land.
Yeah.
And there was land where...
Just for the record, just to be clear, the Brits being the colonizers of that area at the time. So not exactly the people with the most... in the best moral position to be dictating what.
Sure, as opposed to the Ottomans that had colonized it hundreds of years before.
Yeah, the Ottomans were not the ones trying to create that division. So that point is neither here nor there.
Because the Ottoman Empire collapsed, because it was gone. But I'm just saying that regardless, Britain had the territory. They were the ones with the mandate to administer to it. That was the agreement.
The point is importing a Jewish population from Europe and then trying to force the Palestinian population living on the land to leave parts of it in order to allow for a Jewish state to be created is morally wrong. That is...
I mean, it's complicated. I mean, they purchased the land. Yeah, it is. It is complicated.
They did not purchase the land.
They did. A lot of it was purchased. Yeah, the Surstock purchase, they were huge.
Again, you don't know the details, and that's okay. By the time 1948 rolled along, in 1947, when the division of land was coming, the Jewish population made up about 90% of the land, and they owned less... I'm trying to now figure out if I'm mixing up the population and the land ownership. The land ownership was 7 to 9% at the time. And the land division in 1947 that was offered to them gave more than 50% of historic Palestine to a Jewish population that owned 7 to 9% of the land.
That's partially true, but they weren't giving it. That partition plan for the Jewish state wasn't initially given only to Jews. The division of population would have been 55% Jews, 45% Arabs that lived there, which kind of hurts the idea that Jews wanted to expel all the Arabs from the land. That expulsion didn't come until after the surrounding Arab states declared war on the newly emerging state of Israel in an attempt to expel them from the region. What part of what I just said was incorrect? You keep saying no, and then not actually...
I'll tell you which part of what you said is incorrect.
Okay.
30% of the population of the 700,000 plus Palestinians who were driven out before 1948. Before the neighboring Arab armies got
Yes, because there was a civil war that started. Correct, because there was a civil war that started that went from 47 to 49 in that territory. That civil war started because Arabs rejected the partition plan, and then they started to go hard. They wanted to fight. Yes, they rejected the partition plan. They started to fight. Obviously, Israel, not Israel yet, but the Irgun, the Haganah, and the third one, the pre-IDF people started to defend themselves as the Arabs started to fight their villages. There was a civil war that started in 47, and then in 48, all after Israel declares independence, all of the surrounding Arab states decide that they're also going to join and go to war. And unfortunately for them, I guess Israel won that war. And then, a lot of Palestinians fled their villages afterwards because they were worried that their villages were going to get destroyed. And Israel started to grab land, and Jordan grabbed land. That's when they got the West Bank and then annexed it. That's when Egypt came in and they grabbed land. They got the Gaza Strip. That's what happened afterwards. But
No, this is honestly a remarkable attempt at having a conversation.
What did I just say that was incorrect?
The militias that you described pre-1948, before they became the IDF, were considered many of them terrorist groups.
Not
by
really.
British
The Irgun
authorities.
was a Haganah, not as much. It really depends on who you're talking about.
And they've engaged in a campaign of ethnic cleansing. They've gone into Palestinian towns and villages and they've executed people en masse to drive people out. Those are the actions that they engaged in that you just described as self-defense. It is honestly laughable.
Some of it was self-defense. Some of it was massacres. Yeah, absolutely. Of course, they were massacring people on both sides. I'm not saying that the pre-IDF force and even afterwards, Israel's engaged in massacres in towns, horrible ones in Lebanon. Like, I'm not going to say they're totally innocent, of course, but it's not just one side is the aggressor and the other side is this innocent party that is doing nothing. There was Arab violence against Israelis pre-48, yeah.
Yeah, I'll tell you what. Just for the sake of trying to salvage whatever could be possibly productive, I would like to move to what is happening now in Gaza from October 7th, what the immediate precedent for October 7th was, and what Israel is currently engaging in Gaza. Can we do that for a little bit?
Sure.
All right. On October 6th, that is one day before the Hamas attack, the people of Gaza had been living under an Israeli blockade for nearly 17 years. During that blockade, half the population of Gaza is unemployed. A greater number of that are considered to be suffering from basically lacking suffering food insecurity. And 97% of the water in Gaza was considered undrinkable. They got about 12 hours a day of electricity, and they could not trade with the outside world, and they could not leave or come. It was essentially what, again, human rights organizations described as an open air prison. And during that year, just last year, leading up from the beginning of the year until October 6th, Israel had killed more than 250 Palestinians, overwhelmingly in the West Bank, in what human rights organizations have called one of the deadliest years for Palestinian children before October 7th. That was the status quo. Now, the attempts at Palestinian freedom to achieve a situation in which they could live as a free people. They pursued negotiations. Israel did not allow for the creation of a viable Palestinian state and insisted on controlling Palestinians. They pursued economic boycotts. The BDS movement emerged. Israel describes this as economic terrorism and puts pressure on the US, by their own admission, to pass laws that restrict the ability of activists, even here in the United States, to boycott Israel, which actually violates the First Amendment. And that's a whole other conversation that I'm happy to get into as well. They have gone to the International Criminal Court. The US puts pressure on the International Criminal Court to keep it from pursuing Israel. The Palestinians go to the UN and get their friends to try to pass resolutions at the UN to hold Israel accountable. The US intervenes time after time after time to veto any resolution that tries to hold Israel accountable, to a total of more than 50 UN vetoes from the 1970s until today. And to put that into perspective, that is greater than the number of all vetoes cast by all permanent members of the UN Security Council combined on all issues for that same period. So that's the level of U.S. diplomatic protection that they give to Israel.
It also shows the level of aggression the UN has towards Israel. The UN has done more resolutions condemning Israel than like every other country in the world combined.
I think
I think there's also something to be said that like when we talk about how like the deplorable food insecurity conditions in Palestine, isn't it something like 25 to 30% of that population is literally obese? Okay, I don't think that the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip are suffering from starvation. Okay, now there are issues relating to healthy food. There are issues related to cleanliness of water. Like, I'm not going to sit here and say the conditions of the Gaza Strip are great. They're obviously not. And in some cases, they're
that's really
deplorable.
Disgusting, Stephen.
I understand. I know.
Really
I'm sorry. I just wanted to qualify because I know you're about to talk about how October 7th is just the natural outcome of oppressing a people like this, who've also, by the way, as they're starving to death, they're also launching rockets for the past 20 years, trying to kill civilians in Israel as well. But okay.
No, well, I just wish you could reflect a little bit on what you just said and how incredibly offensive and distasteful it is that you have a population that is suffering a manufactured humanitarian crisis because they're under a blockade, as every major human rights organization in the world concedes, and you're here making jokes about the population.
Maybe we should take, first of all, I don't care, if you're not in the region, I don't even care what your opinion is. I don't care what South Africa's opinion is on Israel. Why don't we ask questions about the surrounding countries? Why is it the case that Egypt, for instance, also stopped supplying electricity to the Gaza Strip? Why is it that Egypt is equally motivated to maintain the blockade against the Gaza Strip? Why is it that Jordan doesn't seem to care about the border controls? Could it have to do with the fact that in 1970, the PLO and Arafat literally tried to kill the Jordanian king? Why is it
what
that
you're
like the
talking about.
only
What do you
allies
mean?
that Palestinians have are people like Hezbollah and the Houthis? Like you can paint these broad pictures of how evil BDS is and how evil Israel is, but there are reasons why these conditions exist, and you won't acknowledge any of them. You talk about for 15 years, all they did was suffer these horrible humanitarian conditions. Well, why are they still launching rockets? How can they still launch rockets, thousands of rockets every single year, if there are all these enduring horrible humanitarian conditions?
Yeah, this is hilarious. Yeah, so even in places
I know
where
that you keep saying that this is hilarious. They don't want to get lost in the weeds. They don't want to deal with the history. You just don't know the facts. And people
Very
like
much.
you, by the way,
Yeah.
are contributing to the enduring bad situations on the ground.
No,
because as long as you continue to think there's only one side here that's doing any wrong, there's never going to be any enduring resolution, any lasting peace.
With all due respect, and I'm not sure how much of it actually is due,
Okay.
we have a reality here where you are not interested in the actual merit of the argument at all. And what you like to do is to try to diffuse the situation. You seem to have this bizarre addiction to the idea that both siding this issue is the reasonable and sensible thing to do.
Well, to be clear, hold on. I'm sorry.
Both
I don't
sides-
mean to both sides. If I gave you that impression, I don't mean to both sides. I hold the Palestinians more responsible. Sorry. Go ahead.
Thank you. So that's the fun part here, is that you have these people who think that you want to acknowledge this and you want to acknowledge that. They try to diffuse responsibility here and try to mix things up a little bit as a means of trying to seem more reasonable. And I'm sorry, this does not do you any favors in this case. Throughout history, there are oppressed people and there are oppressors. And even though the oppressed sometimes do things that are wrong and morally indefensible, that does not change the fundamental dynamic of an oppressor and an oppressed population. That is the fundamental reality. And you have a situation right
To be
now.
clear, what you just said, that wasn't the fundamental reality. That was a very generic, vague, random call out that literally said nothing.
absolutely-
There are
and again,
oppressors
a
and
fundamental
oppressees.
reality
Like, what
that
a
the
worthless
entire
statement.
world-
Like,
Yes. Yeah, I know. Yeah, who cares? I tell you that every single major human rights organization in the world says that the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza is imposed by Israel. And
do you
start
also
talking
acknowledge
about-
that they say that, for
and-
instance, like Hamas uses human shields? Because
Yes.
Amnesty International says that. Did
They do not. See, you don't know what you're talking
They
about.
don't? You don't think in
Again, you don't know-
2014
you don't know
in
what you're
a
talking
published
about.
report, you don't think Amnesty International has
You
acknowledged
don't know
that?
what you're talking about. It's just incredible how little you know and
Okay,
how
well, I've actually read the reports. You
You
should
don't know
try
what
it
you're
sometime.
talking
You should read the
about.
reports
You
for the
have not read
flotilla
the
stuff too
reports.
that you try to bring up when you're
You
not
have
aware
not
of. I
read
think
the
it's actually
reports.
really interesting when you read the
Let me-
actual stuff that happens and not just
Let
headlines from
me
tweets.
attempt to educate you for the billionth
Please,
time.
yes, for the
Yeah.
billionth, yes.
So, what human rights organizations accuse Hamas of, including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, is the fact that they operate in civilian areas and hide in civilian areas which endanger civilians. They acknowledge that much. That is not the legal definition of human shield.
That
You know
is
what
the legal definition of. I know
It's
what you're.
not the legal-
Oh, tell me,
you don't
please
know what
give me
you're
the
talking
Finkelstein
about.
quote. Go ahead, tell me what the legal
Yes.
definition. Yeah.
Okay. The use of human shields is placing civilians by force,
Yep.
forcing them against their will to be held in a place in
Yep.
order to
I'm
deteriorate.
aware of this. There is absolutely
Let me
no.
ask you this
There is no.
follow-up.
Hold on. To be clear, for people listening, you can go and look at it if you want. Human Shields, International. I think the Red Cross has a definition of this. Nobody defines human shields as intentionally placing civilians near objects. That is not true. I don't know where Finkelstein got that. It was a quote that came from a. It's a quote that came. We can give it. I can literally give you from the IHL website. It literally says that if you hold on, I'll find it. I'll search it for you if you want. Give me a minute. Go ahead. You can talk while I look for it.
So, while you look for it, let me explain something also to your audience. Do you know who uses human shields in the literal sense?
Oh, Israel does.
IDF does.
So let's break it. The use of human shields requires an intentional co-location of military objectives and civilians or persons with the specific intent of trying to prevent the targeting of those military objectives. If you station yourself around civilians, you are engaged in using human shields. That's why specifically under international law, the ICC recognizes as well, if you have a civilian location like a hospital that's also housing military targets, that target becomes a military target. You have to do all the collateral assessment and everything, but that's literally how international law is written. Correct. That
again,
definition that you gave me for human shields, if you have to force civilians to go to areas, nobody in the international community uses that. Only some pop historians or pop scholars use it because they think it makes their argument sound stronger. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Now let me just squeeze in a few more facts to educate the audience. I'm gonna, at this point, try to see if I can just get around the avalanche of nonsense and see if I can
You
talk.
keep saying avalanche of nonsense. I mean, I
Here's
can
an
cite you
avalanche of
international
nonsense.
law. I can cite you
Allow me-
historical
allow me to
facts. I can
explain to
cite you.
the avalanche of
Go
nonsense.
ahead. Tell me more.
Just give me some room to speak. That's wonderful.
Okay.
So the practice of placing civilians in front of you against their will by force was official Israeli policy from the year 2000 until the year 2005. There are literally countless images on videos of Israelis using Palestinian civilians in front of them, putting the gun over their shoulder and walking them into Palestinian homes when they're conducting raids. And the world was naturally outraged. And the Israeli Supreme Court finally came under pressure and issued a law that said that the use of Palestinian civilians as human shields by the Israeli military should not be allowed to continue. They made it illegal.
Gotcha. So to be clear, you're saying before that, you're saying that the Israeli official policy was to use human shields. That was codified in the military doctrine.
That's official.
It's so
policy.
crazy that they say that, yet the only image I've ever seen of the human shield is that one boy on the Jeep that gets posted 50 billion times over and over again. But okay.
So let me again, allow me to educate you just a little bit more.
Go ahead, educate away.
The reason why this is official policy, and the reason I can prove that to you, is because when the Israeli Supreme Court said you don't get to do that anymore, the Israeli military went to court and appealed that decision. The Israeli Defense Ministry said, fuck you, we want to keep using Palestinian civilians as human shields. So I'm sorry. I know this is inconvenient. I know it hurts your feelings. I know it messes with your idea that the Israelis are wonderful and they're the good guys and I hold the Palestinians more responsible and all that other nonsense. But virtually every accusation made by Israel against Palestinians is an admission of an Israeli policy that pretty much matches it word for word. And the problem is that even though that Supreme Court decision by Israel's Supreme Court held, the Israeli military continued using civilians as human shields on a regular basis, regardless of that. There was an incident recounted in 2008 and 2009 when Israel invaded Gaza during that invasion, where they used a 10-year-old Palestinian boy as a human shield. And when they were caught doing it, Human Rights Watch described Israel's punishment of the soldiers as a slap on the wrist. They demoted those soldiers for using a 10-year-old Palestinian boy as a human shield. That kind of punishment, what it tells you, is that Israel does not take seriously this law and effectively turns a blind eye to it whenever their soldiers engage in it. They've engaged in it multiple times since. There is footage from current raids that are taking place in the West Bank this year where they've used Palestinians as human shields. There are incidents that are recounted by human rights organizations from the past few years. This is an ongoing Israeli practice. It is indisputable. It is factually documented. And the fact that the Israeli Defense Ministry and Israeli military tried to object to the Israeli Supreme Court banning it should tell you everything that you need to know about this. Now, as far as what Hamas does in Gaza, you have a reality is that there is a disparity in power between Palestinian militants who don't have an army, they don't have an air force, they don't have tanks. And so the tactics they use are guerrilla warfare tactics. And anytime you have a force engaging in guerrilla warfare, they can't compete with an army that can just fire a missile from an F-16 and blow you out of existence. So what they do is that they hide in whatever environment they're in. If you're fighting in the jungle, they're hiding in trees. In the case of Gaza, it is almost entirely built from wall to wall.
That's not even close to true. Have you ever seen a map of Gaza before? That's not true. It's not wall to wall buildings. There are plenty of open spaces. They just don't operate out of those because they know they would get targeted.
Yeah, they're an extremely urban area. And so when they engage in guerrilla warfare, they do hide in civilian areas. The intention of that is not to hide specifically. By the way, all these Israeli claims about having a command center under a hospital, which turned out to be false, just the list of Israeli lies about the claims that they have made just in the past few weeks. It's absolutely remarkable. They have just repeatedly made claims that turned out to be false. They've directed people to go to so-called safe zones and then drop 2,000 pound bombs on those safe zones. This was documented even by the New York Times, the fact that they've bombed safe zones with indiscriminate weaponry.
Do you also recognize the documenting that Hamas is launching rockets from declared safe zones as well? Or do you think that that's fake news?
Israel declares those as safe zones, says this is where you have to go, and then drops indiscriminate bombs.
And then Hamas also launches. Nothing is indiscriminate. Oh, you don't know anything about Hamas launching rockets from this area. You know every single Israel attack, but not the Hamas ones.
Yeah,
okay.
I know what human rights organizations document.
Well, you don't. You didn't know that in 2014, Amnesty International said that Hamas was using human shields. So
again, you don't know what you're talking about. I'm happy. I will post that report. I'm happy to clip this particular part and post exactly what Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International said during the 2014 war and outline those for you. Now, the point is, when we're talking about what is happening in Gaza, President Joe Biden said Israel is engaging in indiscriminate attacks. Every human rights organization, including now, suddenly you're a fan of Amnesty International, which is great. So Amnesty International accuses Israel of committing war crimes in Gaza, say that they repeatedly, by the way, not just this last onslaught, but repeatedly accused them of engaging in illegal, unlawful violence against Palestinian civilians. So you take that however you want. If you want, frankly, you bringing up Amnesty International, I think is the cherry on top, if your audience wants to know anything about what Israel is doing in Gaza, I highly recommend they read those reports. And there's no denying that Hamas commits war crimes as well. I mean, you would have to be blind to miss that part. Nonetheless, Israel's war crimes are of far greater scale. It is not even close. And Israel is ultimately responsible for creating a dynamic in which Palestinians are denied freedom, which forces us into a situation in which violence becomes inevitable. People who are upset about apartheid in South Africa, and by the way, the point you made earlier about the ANC not targeting civilians, I would not broadcast that level of ignorance really out loud. You probably should just try to learn a little bit more before you start talking online, because it's really embarrassing for you to not know that the ANC does and has at the time targeted civilians endlessly.
You think the policy of the ANC was to target civilians?
Nelson Mandela was considered a terrorist and placed in prison.
Hold on, wait, I'm sorry.
Government.
Considered a terrorist means that they had an explicit policy of targeting civilians?
Yes,
or was he considered a terrorist because he stood in opposition to the South African government and the apartheid regime?
What you're talking about. It's incredible. The ANC targeted civilians endlessly. They set off bombs endlessly targeting civilians in South Africa.
Targeting civilians, okay.
Yes, right. They have. Gotcha. And you should look it up.
Okay. I have. We read all of this. That's not true. The ANC explicitly only tried to target infrastructure and tried to avoid civilian deaths because they knew it would make them look bad. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
The ANC came out against killing civilians in 1988. You know how much longer they've been carrying out military operations during the apartheid era, when they finally saw that there is significant international support for their anti-apartheid movement, and they decided to shift policy in the very, very last few years of it? Again, just given the back of knowledge that we have between us, and given the incredible confidence with which you speak and your insistence on kind of diluting the core of the issue, and bringing up about 18,000 facts a second whenever you have something to say, in order for us to not be able to have a really productive conversation, I think gets in the way of us really getting anywhere.
Well, those pesky historical facts, they really mess with the narratives and the headline reading.
I can't spend 18 hours debunking every single random thing that you bring
when you don't know any of them, of course not.
Yeah, that's fine. You can take your little jabs and feel good about them. But for anybody who's interested in the actual substance, by all means, human rights organizations are absolutely the source that you should go to. Please go read everything that Amnesty International had to say about the massacre that Israel committed in Gaza in 2014 and the ongoing devastating, indiscriminate massacre where they are absolutely obliterating Gaza. Those are the things that your audience should definitely read. Okay. On this note, I do have kids that wake up from their nap around this time. So genuinely, even though I did not particularly enjoy this conversation and I did not think that you were engaging in it in good faith, I nonetheless do appreciate you making the time for me to come on. So at least to that much, I am grateful.
Yeah, thanks for chatting. Bye.
Take care.
Okay. Somewhere out there will be a pro-Palestinian that knows anything. The oppressor/oppressed narrative is such a huge part of lefty arguments. It seems to justify almost anything in their eyes. It feels like you need to directly confront that narrative. It's just annoying, I guess. I don't know. Why don't you ever steamroll instead of poking holes in their talking points? I feel like I did a combination in that, but just by like the last 20 minutes, it seems like, if you're just gonna say like, oh, you want to get in the weeds, like every time I challenge you on a fact, or like, oh, like you don't know what you're talking about, like anytime I want to challenge you on a fact, he's just like molding because he just knows like talking points. But yeah, whatever. What is the substantive difference between new settlements versus settlement expansion? It's all land grabs at the end of the day. Am I missing something? No, new settlements are way more scary than expanding settlements. I think that the thing that sucks the most for West Bank Palestinians is I think they usually call them enclave settlements. But like, imagine if you're Israel over here, okay, and then this is like the West Bank, okay. If you have like a settlement here, a settlement here, a settlement here, a settlement here, like the scary thing is what you don't want is like a new settlement like here, or like a new settlement like here. I think this is like I think Hebron is like southeast of Jerusalem. I don't know how many enclave settlements there are, but enclave settlements are like annoying as fuck, because what that means is when you finally go to write out like, okay, well now we're finally getting a two-state solution, and now when you're trying to finally write that out or figure out what you want, now your contiguous state is fucked up by these enclave settlements that are in the middle of your territory. And now you need security arrangements for them. You've got to connect them, with highways and shit that's going to be run by the IDF. Like, just enclave settlements are just obnoxious as to deal with. Settlement expansion can theoretically be remedied with, when you go to negotiate, you negotiate with something called land swaps. So let's say Israel's like, well, we don't want to destroy these things because we've got like so much, we've got so many settlements like expanded, built out here. Now it's like, okay, well, fine. Well, we'll give you more land here in the, the Negev desert, or we'll give you more land, up here, whatever. We can start to land swap so that we don't have to destroy these settlements near the Green Line. But yeah, when you start making these like new enclave settlements out here, it f***s up the concept of a contiguous state hardcore, and just the connections and everything just make everything a total disaster. Yeah, I think that like the enclave settlements are probably the worst of all the settlement expansions, although most of it is dumb, but... At Destiny, why do you constantly argue in bad faith? For example, you claim population growth and the ability to launch rockets means the Palestinian people haven't been subjected to food restrictions, despite Israeli officials directly stating they do. There is like a quote-unquote food restriction. Food is restricted going into the country, but you guys don't say there are food restrictions. You guys make it sound like there are like starvation conditions, or that the food is being denied, which is like obviously and clearly not the case. Do you actually hold back when he does the condescending, you don't know anything, let me educate you, or is it easy to ignore these things at this point? I mean, I'll let him do his thing. I feel like it just makes him look bad if I just let him do that over and over. Would an attempted starving still be bad if Palestinians managed to get food in any way? I don't think the Palestinians doubled or tripled their population while being under starvation conditions. And I don't think like 20% of the population being obese is like starvation conditions. It doesn't make any sense. It's just not even good. It's not even good. Like, there are good criticisms of the Israeli blockade in Gaza. Just none of them are made because nobody even knows what the they're talking about. It's all just a virtue signal. Nobody actually gives a about the Palestinians. Nobody really cares. But like, especially when you're going to come in and act all indignant and passionate and blah, 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 but you don't even barely know any of what the talking about. It just like, it's just so retarded. He said food insecurity, not starvation. That was kind of bad faith of you. No, off. The concept of food insecurity is retarded, okay? People use the term food insecurity to try to make it sound like people are starving, because that's what food insecurity sounds like to any normal human being. But most people don't know that food insecurity just means that you might not have access to the highest quality of variety of nutrition or whatever, is what people think food insecurity. They don't know what food insecurity actually means. So no, if people want to define food insecurity in a debate, we can do that. I'll do that if they want. But no, that's bullshit, because people will say there's no food insecurity, they're starving in the next sentence. Don't pretend like everybody knows the technical definition of food insecurity. That's bullshit. They don't. Do people use food insecurity during COVID? People use food insecurity in the United States. But then it's annoying again, because you get a bunch of middle-class white people talking about food insecurity and how in the United States, if you're working class, you're starving. And it's like, okay. Why didn't you pinpoint him on more questions more? You let him take the conversation wherever he wanted. I mean, I tried asking him a few times, but it was pretty obvious that he is just like a headline regurgitator. So, I mean, like, should I literally like go full, like, answer this, answer this, answer this, answer that? Like, I feel like there was one question I repeated literally 5 times. If he's not going to answer, I let him dance, I guess. I also don't like when people want to say that I'm uneducated or uninformed on a topic, and then they complain about getting into the weeds. Why would you not want to get into the weeds if your primary complaint is that I don't know what I'm talking about? But that seems like the best way to prove that I'm a retard, is get into specifics then and show me where I'm wrong. Willie Matt, compliment you to YouTube channel. Oh, cool. If you're looking for a new research topic, why not do Taiwan? Maybe, because I think domestic stuff might be more interesting. Now I'm like super roped into like the Middle East. Like I know like I like all the stories, and like now it's just like DLCs, and it's interesting to read about other parts of the Middle East now that I know other parts of the Middle East, because we can like connect all of it too. So it's like, yeah, it's interesting to listen to like Egyptian involvement in Yemen, and then see how like it them in the 6-day war for Israel. I don't know, it's interesting. Although Yemen has been boring. I think Iran would be more interesting. Okay. I need to do one more pass through all these. Can we do South America? No. The Uyghur stuff would be interesting. I wonder if something debaters are getting their facts from vastly different sources, which are incorrect. No, if that was the case, that would be interesting. If people had different sources, I'd actually enjoy that. That would be interesting. It was like, oh, well, have you seen this thing by this person or this author, this thing? That would be really interesting. The problem is people aren't getting information from other sources. They're not even getting information from like, what is it, primary and secondary? They're not even getting their information from secondary sources. They're getting their information from like quotes from secondary sources. So like a lot of, I think Finkelstein seems to be like a very oft repeated author, like pop historian in this area. And a lot of like that argument that he just made about human shields, which some people in chat were accusing me of lying of. We looked for this. I looked really hard for this. The definition that Finkelstein uses of human shields, that it's exclusively putting civilians in front of your guns and then shooting, I couldn't find that on any international definition for ICC, ICJ. I don't know if ICJ makes rulings of this. ICC and one other org. I think I couldn't find that definition of human shields. Everything that I saw basically had to do with if you locate military objectives near, if you locate military, or rather, what I just described, that can be a human shield, but locating military objectives near civilians or unnamed civilians, that's also a human shield. What was your main conclusion of the original event? During the time Israel was being created, prepared for, isn't that the only point pro-Palestinians could have is the rest from 1950 to 2024 is a shit show that originated from the original event? What do you mean the original event? Like the original Nakba? My view of Israel is I think Israel are opportunists. That if people around them, they will take the opportunity to further their interests. So I'm pretty sure, I think that Israel would have been okay emerging as a country with like a 45% Arab population. I think Israel, because they agreed to the 47 partition, I think so. It seems to be the case. But if everybody else wants to around, then Israel will, not only will they say, oh, well, if you guys want to fight, then you're all getting kicked out. They also, in the 48 war, Israel didn't just take over their 47 partition plan territory. They expanded beyond those lines as well, which is what I think was one of the big calls internationally for other countries to be like, hey, you guys need to stop fighting and chill, because Israel continued to expand their borders past the 47 partition agreement. But it basically seems like that's like the history of like the Arab nations are like, okay, well, we're going to get you this time. And then Israel's like, well, if you're going to try to get us, we're going to get a little bit too. And then they keep expanding that way, basically. Now, Arabs keep saying, or the Arab states, and now broadly speaking, I guess progressives or lefties or whatever, keep saying that Israel was always an expansionist country and they were always going to expand or whatever. And that maybe that is true. I don't think from what the little I've read, I got, no, I'm not even going to say that anymore. Most of you people don't read anything. Okay. From what I've read, it doesn't seem like Israel was going to be a super expansionist nation. However, I can't say that in good faith that I know that. It could be the case that if all the surrounding Arab states were super peaceful, maybe Israel would have actually been on like an expansionist bend. Maybe they would have tried to take over other territory regardless. You know, at the very least, like maybe they would have fought over East Jerusalem because they felt like they were entitled to that entire city or something, you know? Yeah. So, you know, but I don't think anyone in good faith can say, absolutely not. Israel would have never taken any other land if the Arabs would have just chilled. I don't know if anybody can say that in good faith. But I also don't think you can say in good faith, the plan was expansionism the entire time. They were always going to do it and blah, blah, blah. I was like, oh, okay. You sympathize with the Palestinians people during the Nakba. Sure, they didn't have a country, but couldn't you understand their frustration of being pushed out and shit? Yeah, of course. That's why I said, I think that I'd say for the first 20 years, I could understand people in the surrounding area wanting to fight back against Israel. I get it. I get it. I don't think it's wholly unjustifiable. Was the IDF actually using Palestinians as literally human shields? The biggest claims that I've heard of that are, I think, I don't know if they have done this in the past 15 years, but I think early on what they would do is when they were clearing blocks, if they had a Palestinian civilian, they would force them to go into the house first to make sure it wasn't booby trapped or would explode or something, which is a human shield. I'm pretty sure definitionally speaking, having a civilian, commandeering a civilian and then telling them to take part in combat operations is a human shield. So I don't think anybody credible would say Israel's never used human shields. I'm pretty sure they have before, but I don't think it's as big a part of their. And if you think about it logically, it makes sense why it's not even that Israel is good and that Hamas is bad. It's just if you think of the objectives of both sides, you can understand what they're trying to min-max for. I don't think Israel wants to use human shields as much because if they get caught doing it, it's horrible, and the international pressure just makes them look fucking terrible. In 2000, I'm trying to think if this is the first or second Intifada. It might have been the first Intifada where the IDF, there's a video of a father and a son behind a barricade, and the son ends up getting shot by the IDF. Now the IDF contests that they didn't shoot the son. I think most people agree that it was most likely the IDF. Was this the first Intifada or the second? No, it was the second. It was the start of the second Intifada, I think. Because it says 2000. But videos like this make Israel look horrible. So it's not really even in their interest to use human shields unless they really think they can get away with it, or there's no camera evidence or something around, maybe. I'm not saying that. I don't think they're above it. I don't think that morally the IDF's we would never use human shields. It just doesn't serve their interest as much. But for For Hamas, it does. The more dead Palestinians, the stronger their international cause, basically. Hamas doesn't care about civilian casualties on either side. That is not true. Hamas does care. They want more. It strengthens their cause. The more dead civilians, the stronger their cause. And you know that because think about it. What is the only thing anybody knows about this conflict? What is the most quoted thing about this conflict? What's the only thing that anybody talks about? It's the death count. It's the body count. 20,000, 25,000, 50% dead children, 20,000, 10,000 dead civilians, 15,000, 20,000, 300 a day, 500 a day, 1,000 a day, 200 a day. Like that's the only thing that people talk about. Yeah. Why do people say the Oslo Accords failed? I think people say the Oslo Accords failed because there was kind of like... Do people say the Oslo Accords failed? I didn't get that impression from 93 to 2000. It feels like there was like a general unrest or unease. Israel didn't fully stop building new homes and settlements. I think Hamas did a terrorist attack in 94. Fuck, I'm not gonna be able to find this. I don't think I got to a point I wasn't writing down every single fucking massacre. There were still attacks. It wasn't like perfect. But I think the major failing of the Oslo Accords was that there wasn't a long-term peace negotiated afterwards, because that's what was supposed to happen. The Oslo Accords were supposed to be a transition for 5 years, and in 5 years a new second state ideally would emerge. That wasn't penned out exactly, but ideally that was the goal. List of major terrorist attacks since the Oslo Agreement. Victims include citizens of the United States, Israel. More than 100 suicide bombings were carried out. I don't know if this includes any of the IDF retaliations. No, it doesn't. So this is just a record of Islamic or Hamas terrorist attacks. Oh, it might have been this bus bombing in Tel Aviv, but there were still terrorist attacks going on even after the Oslo Accords. I think this might be the big one I was thinking of. Hamas, terrorism, Tel Aviv, 1994. This killed 22 people and injured 50 more. But... would you also hold Ukrainians more accountable if they kept fighting for like Crimea 30 years later? Yeah, I mean, if they agreed to peace and then 30 years later they started terrorist attacking Crimea or whatever, yeah. You mentioned a 20% obesity rate among the Palestinian population, which seems to contradict the reported food insecurity. I would argue that it's not really a good argument for contradiction. For example, Yemen has a 17% obesity rate despite being in the midst of one of the world's worst humanitarian... So, hold on. Okay, I'm glad you brought this up, okay? Food insecurity means... that let me look this up for you, okay? Food insecurity means that you don't have access. Well, I think the FDA might have 4 different levels of food insecurity, but okay, so this term, it's when people don't have enough to eat and don't know where their next meal comes from. This is the most extreme form of food insecurity, but the most common one is this one. When people mention food insecurity, they want to use this definition where people don't have enough to eat, but they're including all of this up to marginal food security, which is households have problems at times accessing food, quality and quantity were not substantially reduced, meaning that they're not getting a balanced diet, right? This is the one that people cite the number of because it's the biggest number, but then they want to make it sound like it's like starvation conditions, which is not true. Also, just from the little bit that I know, the Gaza problem with food insecurity I don't think is anywhere remotely like the Yemen problem with, I don't even like to say food insecurity for Yemen. In Yemen, a lot of those people are under starvation conditions, meaning you've got hospitals full of women who, one, can't feed their babies because when a woman's body is stressed, a whole bunch of bad shit happens with her hormones, and one of those things is you no longer lactate. So women can't even feed their fucking babies because they're starving. Not because they don't have enough high quality greens and spinach, they're starving. And two, the babies are starving, okay? They've got the huge bloated bellies. They have to get like IV. They've got to get like, proper nourishment to bring them back to even being like, okay. Like, yeah, in Yemen, my understanding of the little thing, in Yemen, the people are actually starving, like there's starvation, like people are dying of starvation and their children are malnourished. Malnourished meaning not getting adequate calories. Like they're not going to grow up with the proper height. They're going to have long-term, long-lasting conditions for their health. My understanding is that is not the case at all in the Gaza Strip. I could be wrong on that. If someone wants to link me that or something, I would be interested in that because it would update my understanding of the Gaza Strip. But like, for instance, and I'm going to go super anecdotal here. Fuck it, I'll Google it actually. If I like so I'm Googling starving people Gaza Strip. I haven't seen the videos or the pictures of like starving, like the bloated bellies, the horrible shit in the Gaza Strip. I just haven't seen it. Maybe it is there and I just haven't looked for it though. So I'll do a little bit of digging now. But like, also, starving people, food insecurity is bad no matter what, okay? So I'm not trying to like, I don't want to like make it sound like, oh, like you're food insecure, fuck you or whatever, right? But like, Jesus Christ. Okay, fuck. It's like, so if I look for starving, okay, and I admit they're just Google searches. Christ, I looked at my other computer. If I look for starving children, Gaza Strip, okay, like this is sad, okay, and it's bad, okay, but like here are my starving children in the Gaza Strip, okay, and it's sad having to wait around for food like this is tragic, okay, it is sad, okay, but if I look for like starving children Yemen. Okay, this is not the same thing, okay? We are absolutely not even remotely talking about the same type of thing in these two areas, okay? That's just what I want to, because when people say food insecure, or they say that they're putting the Gazans on a diet, or they're trying to starve them out, this is what you're bringing to mind. These are the actual conditions in Yemen, okay? Yeah. It's a different thing. It's not good. I'm not saying I support it or that food insecurity or whatever is good, but they're not the same thing. Not even remotely comparable, in my opinion. If you're saying that some percentage of the Yemenis population is obese, I would believe you. But it's because Yemen is a country, is a region, I don't even know what you would call it, that has been plagued with corruption for long periods of time. I think Yemen is not food insecure. They're in a famine. That's beyond just insecurity. Yeah, sure. Yeah, Yemen is in a famine. And the food that they do get gets commandeered by other groups, one being the Houthis, where it's not even sent to the people that are starving. Who was it? I think the UN and I think Norway and their food council said that they were going to stop sending food to Yemen because they can't even guarantee that any of it gets to any of the people that need it. They feel like the Houthis just commandeer all of it. Hey, was wondering, when someone says they want to debate in good faith and they say stuff like you're confused or you're out of your depth on an issue, isn't that a green light to go super hard on them in a debate? Kind of. I'll go super hard if I feel like I need to, but if I feel like the other person is making themselves look dumb, then I will, then I'll just let them do their thing. Isn't Gaza also corrupt? The corruption in Gaza doesn't seem to me to be as bad as the corruption in Yemen. The problem in Yemen is it's not just corruption in Yemen. It's also the fact that like Yemen isn't like a real state at all. It's like always been it seems like it's always been like a collection of like tribes, and then people have tried to impose like some broader government. So it's the fact that there's not really a cohesive state in Yemen, and that Now the controlling power of the Houthis they're not really like a government. They never wanted to be. I think they didn't. I think they were uncomfortable with how much into the controlling power they've been thrust into. It's just that's just not really ran like a country ever. So Gaza is administered like as a country or as a state or whatever. Like it is, regardless if they do good or bad, regardless if you feel like Hamas steals shit, they do. But like it's not Hamas in the Gaza Strip is not quite as fucked as Yemen is, which is just a fucked place and has been fucked for a long time. You say this tribal thing, but all the Gulf is tribal. It's not really unique to Yemen. Is that true? I don't know how true that is. I feel like the royal families, this is all purely feelings based, so I could be totally wrong. But I feel like the royal families in Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, and Bahrain, I feel like they command enough respect and prestige and power and seem to be able to run a country effectively. As opposed in Yemen, the tribes felt far more scattered and far less cohesive and capable of governing a whole state. Seems to be the case. I don't know the history of all the other Gulf states, so I can't say that 100%, but that's the feeling I get. It feels like the Jordanian king, feels like the Saudi Arabian king, crown prince, and all these other people can administer, but I don't think Yemen has ever had stable rulership, at least in modern history. I don't know, before like 1850 or whatever, maybe they did, but the entire Middle East has tribes that control areas, but it's like local militias, not state governments. I mean, kind of, but like some of them have, like, I think Jordan has like a whole ass government and runs their shit. I think that Saudi Arabia has a whole ass government that seems to run their shit, Bahrain is only kept afloat by Saudi Arabia. Yeah, but people can't even keep Yemen afloat, right? Like, to even be able to keep afloat a place shows that there's some level of stability there, Yeah. More countries pause funds for UN Palestinian agency. Oh, I saw this, that some people were saying that there were members of the of this UN agency that were probably involved in the October 7th attack stuff, but I haven't dug into this enough to know how strongly I feel about this. Our good friends, the UNRWA. Do you think that guy made any good points at all? No, he didn't know enough to make any good points. The agency said on Friday it opened an investigation to several employees, severed ties with those people, encouraging more donor suspensions. Israeli Foreign Minister Israel Katz said that UNRWA should be replaced once fighting the enclave dies down, and accused it of ties to Islamist militants in Gaza. In Gaza's rebuilding, UNRWA must be replaced with agencies dedicated to genuine peace and development, he added on X. Yeah, the UNRWA just seems like wacky as fuck. Do you believe some countries rewrite history for their own interests? Related to primary and secondary sources, a bit confused in your stance. A country rewriting their history, the only way, I think that it depends. I think that, I'm going to be a huge Western cuck here. I think that if you're a democracy, I think that you're kind of letting people audit your history, which I think is good. I think that's one strength of democracies. Like, I think it's good that we can be very critical of Israel for some of the things that they've done in relation to the Palestinian people in their own history and in relation to attacks in other countries around them. But part of the reason why we can do that is because Israel's a democracy that opened their archives and published some previously classified material that allows, like the new Israeli historians to go through and audit some of Israeli history. I don't think like Saudi Arabia would ever do that, right? I don't think Egypt would ever do that. I don't think, other types of regimes like just don't do that as much. So can they rewrite history? I mean, it's hard because everybody else around them can analyze their history and have their takes, but yeah. So you agree there are vastly different sources that specific nationalities believe and subject that population to it? It's kind of, I mean, it's going to depend on the topic. Like, I think a broad general problem with Arabs in the Middle East is they genuinely believe, like, Jewish conspiracies are like the underpinning of their entire understanding of the world. That Jews control all of the West, all of the banks, all the countries, and that's a thing that a lot of them believe. I don't know how relevant that is to their day-to-day life or how much it matters, but yeah. It's probably a problem. Do you think allowing states like Iran and North Korea into the UN was bad because they weaken the ability of the UN to do anything? Or is it better to have these bad states in the UN because at least you can try to make deals? There's like this fundamental principle of government. It's a hard balance, but like it's the idea that slow, more representative governments are better than smaller, less representative governments. So like the US system, for instance, it's criticized a lot for being very slow and not responsive, but like founding fathers would argue that slowness is good. These things should take a long time. You should need to build big consensuses to do major changes. Otherwise people revolt and you get like a lot of violence. The UN is similar. You know, people look at the Security Council and permanent members on the Security Council and they'd be like, oh wow, like why the fuck is Russia and China here? Like congratulations, now you guys can't do anything. And it's like, okay, well, what about the alternative where major countries are deciding to do things and Russia and China isn't happy with that? Well, in the UN, at least they can give it a big old, read it down vote and say, fuck you. But, if they weren't involved in it, well, now what? Military options, massive sanctions, or, territorial control or invasions? Like, so it sometimes it's annoying that like, wow, why is this country even part of the UN, blah, blah, blah. But like, you want everybody in the UN. You really want everybody involved. You really want everybody invested in the outcomes of everything that's happening, I'm from a Muslim country, and Jews controlling everything isn't even a conspiracy. It's considered a fact. Yeah, I think that's just like taken as, yeah. Remember how you used to say that censorship would result in Westerners not knowing how to properly argue against Nazis, Jew hate, and then it happened like a year later? Yeah, but what are you going to do? But I also said that Republicans have become increasingly untethered from reality, and that is also a huge problem. It's probably the biggest problem in the United States right now. Maybe the biggest problem in the world, depending on how important you think the U.S.'s place is in the world. Actually, it even affects, it does affect the rest of the world too. What is it? A country divided against itself cannot stand? Like imagine how different our support or our condemnation could be for things related to Ukraine or Israel if we weren't like literally on the verge of civil war in our own fucking country, But this is exactly how Republicans feel about leftists. That's fine, but one side is right and one side is wrong. I'm sorry. Like, Republicans have become untethered from reality. Leftists are untethered from reality, but leftists are like 2% of the Democratic Party, and Republicans that are, MAGA ride or dies are like 80% of the Republican Party. Did I say Democrat or Republican? Sorry, I think I mixed that up. But leftists are like 2% of like the Democratic Party. Republicans are like ride or die MAGAers are like 80% of the Republican Party. It's like, it's not even remotely the same,